Salesforce is full of limits, and there are many different types. Some are constant, some change based on licenses or Salesforce approval. We'll be focusing on Apex transaction limits. These limits are constant. The only time they are different is based on whether the transaction is an asynchronous transaction or a synchronous transaction. As a quick definition, synchronous transactions are transactions that occur right away, and asynchronous transactions generally occur at a future time. They are your batch, queuable, and future classes. And just to show, if you type in governor limits, Salesforce or Apex, this should come up, and there's the per transaction Apex limits. As you can see here, there's a list of synchronous limit transaction limits and asynchronous transaction limits. And as we can go through, we can see some of the more common ones are going to be your SOQL queries issued. You can only have 100 SOQL queries within one transaction. You can only have 50,000 records that are queried. You can only have 20 SOSL queries, 150 DML statements, and kind of a full list of other ones if you would like to take a look at them. Most of these limits are in the debug logs as well, which we will take a look at. I'm going to clear out both of these. And then just as a quick way to show, if we create and insert an account, it will come up with the logs. Transaction limit is what we'll call this account. And run. And as we can see here, we can see in this transaction, the number of SQL queries that occurred are 0 out of 100, query rows 0 out of 50,000, and so forth. The number of DML rows is 1 of 10,000. In a transaction, you can only insert 10,000 records. And then you can only, you can only have 150 DML statements in total. So that'd be your insert, update, delete operations. These are all constant limits. There isn't a way to increase these limits. They're just per transaction what occurs. So that's a lot of what you are going to be kind of bound to, or the container of which you work is going to be within these transaction limits. And as we can see right here, another example, we were talking about heap size a couple lessons ago. Right here, maximum heap size, 0 out of, what does it say, 6 million, and these are bytes, so they would be 6 megabytes. So the most common limits or exceptions that you're going to be hitting because of the limits is going to be your SOQL limits, your DML. So the SOQL is the 100 limit, your DML statements of 150, heap size I've seen a bit as well, callouts, the number of callouts, and a lot of these happen because of operations that are occurring within for loops. So we'll take an example of what I mean by that. So let's say we have a traditional for loop, and within that traditional for loop, we're going to have the integer I equal to 0. I equals 0. And then we're going to hit the 150 DML statements exception. So again, we can only have 150 DML statements. We're going to do 151 and see what happens. So we do I is less than 151, and then I plus plus. And then within our code block, we are just going to insert, we'll take this right here, and we will insert. So this is going to loop through 151 times, and each time it's going to try to insert an account record. And as we can see, when we scroll down towards the end, we can see system limit exception, too many DML statements, 151. And we can also see right here within, it says 151 out of 50, too close to the limit. When you're getting close to the limit, Salesforce will kind of indicate that. There are methods. There is a limit class as well. Within that limit class, you can check to see how many limits you have left within that transaction. So if you wanted to do any limit-based logic, you can start doing that. We're not going to really cover or go through. I showed a little bit of the limits, the get limits when we were looking at the heap. But if you wanted to explore that class, there's many other methods that you can use in order to identify and figure out how many limits you have left, either you've currently used or what the max is within that transaction. Let's hit the SQL query limit as well. So to hit that one, we don't know how many accounts we currently have within the org, so we'll keep this one and we'll just create 150 accounts. So we're not going to hit we'll be close to the DML statement limit, but we're not going to hit that exception. And then what we're going to do is, let's say that we have a list of accounts. We want to loop through that list of accounts, and for each one, we want to get the number of contacts that are associated to that account, and then we want to update the account with that new number, or we'll do the account name with that. So what we would do for that is, if we have a list of accounts and then account list and then select ID name from account, and we can just grab all of them. And for, we want the account, and the variable is going to be ACCT, loop through the account list. And then what we want to do is we want to get we will use an aggregate function to get the number of contacts that are associated to that account. So we'll do integer, and then we'll call it contact count. And then, so the statement for that is going to be select count ID from contact where account ID equal to, and we'll the account ID. So this would be the query, the aggregate query to get the number of contacts that are associated to the account. One thing with aggregate queries is the return is going to be an aggregate result, and we want it just to be the integer itself. So in order to do that, what we can do is we can pull out the first result, and then there is a get function for each of these. If you had multiple, let's say that you had multiple aggregates within here, within that list, you can get, and each one, so let's say that we had an average as well, and then there was a number that we needed to average up as well. Each of these would be an expression, and they would be marked with EXPR 0 would be the count ID, EXPR 1 would be the average. We'll leave out the average, so we'll just do EXPR 0. And then we need to cast that into an integer as well. So then if I take a count.name and then I just update the name and add the contact count. So really this whole thing, not important. More than likely, you'll never have an ask for this. The whole purpose of this is just to get that SQL limit, or not the SQL, the SOCL limit, and to show that having a SOCL statement within a for loop, the error that you will get from that. So really, this whole part even, you don't need to worry about too much. It's just the fact that every single time that we loop through a record, we're going to be doing another query. Okay, as I run that, contact count, oh, I spelled that wrong. Okay, as we run that, we're creating the accounts. And then we see right here, limit exception, too many SOCL queries 101. So as you can see, when we look at the limits, we can see number of SOCL queries 101 of 100, close to limit. And then you can see the 150 that we did close to limit. Now all of these, when we did the DML statement limit and got the 151, and now when we got this SOCL limit of 101, each of these transactions failed, so everything's going to be rolling back. So we really didn't create 151 accounts plus the 150 within here. Those transactions were rolled back. If you remember when we were talking about transactions in the last lesson, we were talking about how those can get rolled back. So most of the time, you're not going to, if you see something like this, you see a for loop and then you see a DML statement like this, or you see a for loop and you see a SOCL query like this, that's where that should be a red flag right away, indicating that there is potential for these errors to occur. Now, most of the time, that doesn't happen. Most of the time, what you will see is you would see a for loop. Let's just copy this one. And within that for loop, it's not going to be referencing a DML operation. It could reference a class that is created called, we'll say that there's an Apex class called create account. And within create account, there is a new account class or method. And what that would do is each time you run this, it's going to create a new account. More than likely, that's something where it would happen like this, where within the for loop, you're calling a different class and method. And within that class and method, it's going to have the singular operations. And that's where when you create for loops and you put classes in there, you need to know what's happening with that class. Is that class doing a call out every single time? And are you going to be looping through 101 times to be able to hit that limit of 100 callouts per transaction? Are you only going to be, or are you going to be doing more than 100 SOCL queries when you loop through this? Are you going to be doing more than 150 DML operations? Those are things to consider and to think about when we're going through for loops and starting to call and create these different classes and the complexities start to compound, is that this is a more likely scenario to happen than this. Not saying that this wouldn't happen, but this is probably where this is easy to spot. This is a lot harder to spot. And that's really what I wanted to talk about with limits. A lot of these transaction limits are going to be hit with for loops. There could also be ones that get hit from just a really long cascade of events that occur, but a lot of it will be for loops. So then how do you make sure that these limits don't get hit? Or what is it that you're going to be doing in order to prevent this from occurring? One thing that you could do is you would create a list. So let's say we would have this list account up here, and then we would have an account list, and that account list would just be a new list. And instead of inserting this account, you would be adding it to that list. And then you would have the insert right below where you would be inserting. So this would then, instead of having 150 inserts, it would just be one insert. That's where sets and maps come in play for SOQL queries. With this one as an example, you would get a set of the account IDs, and then you would loop through those and run this code block instead of having the SOQL query within the for loop. The biggest thing is that you want to get those outside of the for loop.